All right. Excellent. All right. So let me start. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for organizing this event. This is really interesting and I think very relevant to a lot of people, a lot of young researchers. So I'm very happy that you give me the opportunity to share my personal experiences at my scientific journey for like over the last decade or so. And yeah, I want to say a few more things about my scientific career starting in Germany and how it came about that I went to the US. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more. And it was mentioned in the beginning, but let me just go back there. I'm a theoretical or computational physicist by training. I am personally very interested in the development of educational open source code developments, which means we are really trying to write computer programs in a way that is accessible to a larger crowd, especially for inexperienced users. And I obtained expertise in electronic structure theory, broadly defined. Mostly it's density functional theory, or DFT, and its extensions, which is a self-interaction correction, which is simply designed to make the approximations we use better. I also obtained some experience in metal organic frameworks, which is a material class which typically exhibits porous volume. You see that in the middle on the lower side of this screen. And I currently also develop so-called exchange correlation functionals. It's more technical details, but this broadly who I am as a scientist. I am involved in the so-called OpenSRC and OpenMAF projects, which are really designed to bring these kind of ideas to a broader audience and to make them easier to understand. I also like coffee. You see the little coffee mug over there. And I do drink a lot of that. And I also like loud music, typically metal and hard rock. And I attended a number of festivals in my day. So this is more or less a summary who I am as a person and summarizing more or less my interests. And in order to start explaining really where I'm from, I can show you a little bit of a map of Germany. So I'm from Germany. I'm from Dresden, which is right over here in the eastern part of Germany, which is where I grew up, where I went to school, and eventually I graduated high school in Dresden. And then I moved on to other parts of Germany, which I will talk about in just a little on the other slides that I have. But the basic story is that I am from Dresden. And before I start going into my really my scientific career, I'd like to talk a little bit about, the time before I went to university. And again, this is my personal story. So just to give you a little bit of a background, what I did before I actually went into academia. So the first thing that happened is that I finished high school, which was awarded with the so-called Abitur. I think Florian Günther talked about that earlier. This is the university entrance certificate in Germany, which allows you to go to any university in Germany without any additional tests at the specific university you want to go to. Now, I want to mention here that in high school, I was not a straight A student. I was actually pretty bad, to be honest. And I mention this because I want to make it clear that while currently I might be working at a Stanford University, right? It's a big name and whatever. I wasn't always very, very good at school. And it took me a lot of time to develop myself. And I'm going to go through some of the things that helped me along the way to, develop myself to find myself as a scientist and develop myself personally as well. So takeaway message is, I wasn't good at school, but I got better. Now, the other thing that back in my day, when I finished high school, was that there was a mandatory military service for 9 months in Germany, which was overall not a great experience, let's just say, especially right after high school, where you kind of sort of studied for 12 years, right? You do all your exercises, you do all your examinations, and you keep learning and learning and learning. And then in the military, you stop thinking, essentially, because everybody just simply tells you what you are supposed to do. And doing that for 9 months was not necessarily helpful in any way. So right after these 9 months, I had to make a decision. I had to decide whether I want to go straight to university, which was my overall plan. I just didn't quite know at that time in which direction I would want to go. I knew it was science, but I didn't quite know whether it would be physics or chemistry or something else. So the other thing that came up as an opportunity was to go for 1 year to a different country. And I decided to do that. So I decided to go to Australia with a program that was called Farm and Travel, which means I spent 6 months in the middle of the desert. You can see down there in the picture, that was my workplace. And I spent half a year there. And then I spent another half year to essentially travel Australia and kind of sort of get to know the people back there. And what this year taught me was that, or what it helped me to do, is to build a lot of self-esteem for myself and a lot of confidence for myself, because this was the first time for me that I would go by myself to a different country. I didn't really speak the language in the beginning. So what actually happened was that within the first few weeks, I kind of decided to go back because I didn't really think that I could do it. But after overcoming these initial hurdles, it actually turned out to be a really great year for me and a great life experience, which again helped me a lot later in life due to the building of confidence. But it wasn't easy in the beginning, but it became better once, I established myself and I got used to the new environment. So then after Australia, I came back to Germany, and then I decided, okay, now I want to go to university, and having my university entrance certificate made that easier because now I just had to decide where I wanted to go. And the decision for me was to do my bachelor and master degree at the Technical University in Freiberg, because they offered the course which is called Applied Natural Sciences. So back at that day, I still wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do academically. I knew I wanted to do something with natural sciences. So this course of Applied Natural Sciences basically combines physics, chemistry, biology, and math, and allows you to study all of that. And just in the end, in your master studies, you can specify if you want to go more towards physics or biology or something else. Now, the university in Freiberg is a very small university. Really, in Freiberg, you have the university and pretty much nothing else, which is great for studying because you can't really get distracted. You also have very, very long winters, which doesn't really allow you to do things outside. So it's kind of sort of a great environment to really do your bachelor's and master's there. And I said in the beginning that I am a theoretician now, but I actually started my academics in experimental physics. And I actually did my bachelor's and my bachelor thesis in experimental physics. I then realized pretty much right after finishing my bachelor's that experimental physics is not really my thing, because I didn't feel that I really learned anything or that I really advanced myself enough to, to justify staying in experimental physics. So I then switched, and for the entirety of my master's, I was in theoretical physics. And at some point in my life, and I think I was like 23 years old, I then had more or less the epiphany that theoretical physics is really what I wanted to do, that I found my passion in theoretical physics. And ever since, I know exactly, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is where I belong, and this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But you can see that I didn't know that until, I was almost in my mid-20s. So it's not to say that you need to know when you're very young what you want to do academically if you want to stay in academia, but that sometimes it takes time to really realize what you want to do. And for me, I got lucky enough that I had this experience and that I got to find my passion. I also want to say that during my master's studies in the very end, I got involved into teaching. So already at this pre-doctorate level at German universities, we have the opportunities to get involved in teaching. What I taught back then was just a basic Python programming course. But it was a good experience for myself because I had to learn how to teach. And I also realized that I really like teaching, which is, of course, a positive thing if you want to stay in academia, because eventually, if you want to stay in academia for the long term, you will encounter teaching at some point. Right, so I got my bachelor's and my master's done. So, of course, the next logical question is, what do I do now? And given that I wanted to stay in academia, the really only logical step is to do a PhD. So then I got this great opportunity to do my PhD back in Dresden, which is, again, where I'm from. So I was able to go back home to do my PhD at the Technical University of Dresden. And in Dresden, my position was actually sponsored by the so-called Support the Best grant, which was a scholarship for 3 years. And the way this worked was that there was a little workshop of 4 professors of the university who looked for 4 PhD students. And there were 3 experimentalists and 1 theoretician. So clearly for me, the only logical choice would have been to go to the theoretical professor. And what we did back then was that everybody of the applicants would give a presentation, kind of sort of presenting what we're currently working on, which for me was just the things I worked on in my master thesis. And afterwards, the professors had to decide who they want to take on as a PhD student. And, well, my former boss then gave me that opportunity, so I ended up doing my PhD in Dresden. Now, Dresden is a larger university, and Dresden in of itself is a way larger city, so there's a lot more to do, which is kind of nice. About this scholarship, this stipend, there are pros and cons to that, and I'm pretty sure that Florian mentioned a few things about it. You're either employed or you get this kind of scholarship. Now, the scholarship, you could say the nice thing about it is it's tax-free. So you really get out what you get out. But you got to consider that it's not a lot. And especially when I started my PhD studies in Dresden, I had like $20 in my bank account. And that wasn't really enough to pay rent. So especially during the first few years of my PhD studies, I had to work next to my actual studies at the university to kind of sort of support myself. In addition to that, given that you are not employed at the university, there's no coverage from the university for your insurances. So you have to take care of that all by yourself, which is A, a hassle, and B, it also costs even more money. So you really have to consider that a stipend can be nice, but it has certain disadvantages in the long term. And I got lucky enough that after the 3 years of this scholarship ran out, my boss actually employed me for the remainder of my time so I could finish my thesis. And the beauty about my PhD studies were that I also got involved much more so into teaching. I was in charge of a number of computer labs, which was great. It was a great experience to talk to different students and kind of sort of explain different concepts in different ways so that I make sure that everybody understands it on their own terms. So I think that gave me a lot of insight into the basic fact that I really like teaching, and I really wanted to do that. So in the very end of my PhD thesis or my PhD time, I actually got the opportunity to teach an actual lecture. So my boss gave me that opportunity. It was the Introduction to Quantum Chemistry, which was positive twofold. The first thing was that I had to give the lecture in English. And given that English is the scientific language, it was a good opportunity to strengthen my English at that time. And also, it just simply gave me the opportunity to teach an actual lecture and to see what's involved. I mean, it requires a lot of preparation, but you also learn a lot. So I think I learned a lot, and I hope the students that attended that lecture did as well. So this is the shortest discourse about my PhD time. And now I got my bachelor's, my master's. Now I got my PhD. What do I do now? Well, given that I still wanted to stay in academia, I had to make the decision that I want to stay in academia for the long term. And the next logical step for me was to find a postdoc position. And I had the simple-minded feeling that now that I have a PhD, and I got a PhD from a German university, from a large university, it should be relatively easy to get a postdoc position. It turned out it's not really all that easy. And I will talk about that in just a bit, just to kind of sort of get back to the main topic of this workshop in terms of globalization. I did my master's in Freiberg, which took me about 2.5 years, and then I did my PhD in Dresden. And you can see I didn't really travel all that much within these 6 years, right? Dresden and Freiberg are very close to one another. But then I got the opportunity to go to the US and traveled from Dresden about 7,000 kilometers just to arrive at Michigan, where Central Michigan University is located. And then after 3 years working at CMU, I traveled another 4,000 kilometers just to be at Stanford University, which is where I've been working ever since last year. So that's kind of sort of the dimensions of travel that I underwent in order to be where I am right now. And it has been a great journey. But to really go back to the question, okay, I want to do a postdoc. Why can't I find one? My initial motivation for postdoc was actually the year in Australia that I had, because I wanted to go back to Australia. I never really intended to go to the US. So I looked around for postdoc positions. I looked in Australia, I looked in Europe, I looked at many different places, and I simply could not find a postdoc position that was in any way suitable for me. So after months and months of trying to find a postdoc position, my PhD advisor actually told me about this postdoc position in the US at Central Michigan University. And I had a look at that position, and it sounded really great. It was really in line with all the scientific endeavors that I wanted to do. It was very much in line with what I wanted to do as a scientist. So it was really a position that was too good to not apply for. And I did. And I got the position in the end, which was great. Of course, I had in the back of my head that the US is really what currently defines the frontiers of science. And given the project that I started to work in, we really did something that hasn't really been done before, which was very exciting to me. So as a takeaway, even though that I got my degrees in Germany and everything, it's not a guarantee that you will get a postdoc position or another position right away. There's still a lot of work involved and a lot of time and effort that you have to put in. Right, so I ended up at Central Michigan, and the few things that are, I think, very important takeaway messages when you are in the US. A few things that I found very, very interesting and I think very relevant is, first of all, the scientific diversity in the US. If you do science in the US, if you do research in the US, you will find that science and research is really carried out and driven by people who are not from America. And I would say that the relation is about 70 to 30. For example, the group that I worked in at Central Michigan University was comprised of my boss, who was American, and then of 5 or 6 other people who were non-American. So there was clearly an offset there. And that was really beautiful because you had people from all over the world. You had people from Nepal, from Sri Lanka, from Syria, from Argentina, and me from Germany. So you really get a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different lives that they have lived before. You bring them all together. And with that, you bring a lot of different and diverse ideas and perspectives on one and the same problem. And that really helped us to solve problems in a much more efficient way, and also helped us personally to really think outside the box and potentially outside our own box, that is our own perspective, and to look beyond that and really learn something about ourselves. So this was really, really great. And having this many people with this many different backgrounds also created a lot of different interesting discussions, and with that led ultimately to very interesting science. And I really valued that. And this is also, again, with respect to the global topic today, without any globalization and without any people who would go to the US and drive science in the US, science wouldn't happen in the US. So for the US, it's actually vital that people come and do science in the US, because otherwise the US would not be the scientific forefront that it is currently. Another thing that I think a lot of people have this perception that the US is like the golden standard of what science is currently. Like, this is where science comes from. And I want to give my perspective on that. So I have these different bullet points here. The first thing is that the statement that the US is the forefront of science. And I think currently, at least, this is true to an extent, because first of all, it depends on what kind of science you're talking about. Science in the US should always benefit the US. And not all science does that. So if you want to get involved, then it should be a project that ultimately benefits the US in one way or another. And I think the other thing is that certain areas of science are significantly stronger outside of the US. Now, another thing that I think is true, and I experienced that myself, is that if you go to the US, you can get involved into emerging research areas. And for me, this was true when I started in Michigan in the US. We did research that simply hasn't been done before. And this was really exciting, and I learned a lot. I, however, think this is not limited to the US itself. I think emerging research areas are a global thing, but in the US, you can, again, get involved in something that really is fundamentally new. I also heard this statement that who hasn't been to the US is not a real scientist. And I think this is absolutely wrong, because while I am in the US, so I have sort of the inside perspective, I think that pretty much no matter where you go, as long as you have a passion about science and you want to spend that time and effort in academia, then it doesn't really truly matter where you go, as long as you really have the ambition to do proper science and you find a group that supports that, which you can find in the US. But honestly, in my opinion, science, and this is the last bullet here really, science can and should be done anywhere in the world. And it is done anywhere in the world. It's not only located in the US, it's in Europe, it's in Asia, it's even in Australia and South America. So US is one place that you can go to really learn something and to support the scientific endeavors, but it isn't the only place. Right. Let me go to some additional advantages that I found in the US and working in the US. And again, I think this is potentially true for other areas in the world as well. So first of all, a really good thing was that while working in the US, I had the opportunity, and I think this was very relevant, to stay in contact with my colleagues in Germany who worked in Freiberg, who I still work with today. And we created some active collaborations and cooperations between my group that I had in the US and the people that I used to work with and still work with. And I think this is really relevant, also with respect, again, to globalization, because if you stay within your own group and your own, sphere, your own bubble, and you can't get out, then you will get stuck. And if you let other people in and other perspectives, then you have a much better chance to really do something that is relevant to the scientific community. Furthermore, and this is more so if you really want to stay in academia, a postdoc, and again, not necessarily in the US, allows to advance in science. It should really be the stepstone between doing your PhD and getting some more permanent position in terms of a professorship. As a personal note, I went to the US, I didn't know anyone, and it just happened to be that I found the love of my life, who I ended up marrying, and this is ultimately really the reason why I am still here. And I think this is slightly different to the story that I believe Florian Günther has told you earlier. He found the love of his life and then went to Brazil. I went here without having anyone, but I ended up finding someone who I'm very happy with right now. So it can happen that unexpected personal things happen next to the scientific endeavors that you will face when you go to a different country for whatever reason. Right. Let me talk a little bit about, and I think, again, this is mostly with respect to the US, but has other implications for you if you decide to go to a different country. Now, there were most certainly some hurdles that had to be overcome in order to go to the US. And for me, this was additionally tricky because I finished my PhD in August of 2017. And at the end of September, I was already traveling to the US. So the few months before I actually defended my thesis, there were so many things to do and so many things to consider, and many things I did not consider. So I just want to give you a brief overview of things that should be considered if you have the time before you actually travel to another country. Now, the one thing, and this is very relevant in the US, is a visa. The visa process for the US is a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of things to consider. It's a hassle. It's a lengthy process, and it takes a lot of time. And doing this under time pressure was not the most enjoyable experience that I had. I made it work, but if you have more time, this will be much easier. Another thing that you want to consider is finding a place to live. If you're not, like for me, I wasn't in the US, so finding a place to live was very, very difficult. And I actually got lucky enough that my former boss took care of my apartment, of my first apartment that I had there. But keep it in mind that if you're not there, it can be difficult in the beginning to find a place to live, and you might want to have someone who's actually in the other country to help you out. One more thing is, what do you bring? The thing is, you can't bring your entire household. You have to give up a lot of the things that you have right now, because ultimately what you can bring is like a single luggage bag. So really, what do you bring and what do you leave behind is one thing to consider. And something that hit me personally relatively hard was that given that I was traveling under immense time pressure, I arrived in the US where I've never been before. I went to the Central Michigan University, which is also in a very small town, and I had no social network whatsoever. I had my coworkers that, I kind of sort of knew, but they are not automatically my friends. And outside of the university, there wasn't much to do to socialize. And with that, I really had the problem in the beginning that I didn't know anyone. And this led me to do things that I shouldn't have done, which is work 15 to 18 hours a day in my first few months, which was really bad. I do not recommend that at all, because I got really burned out after like 2-3 months working there. And then I had to recalibrate and, starting to find some friends and whatnot. So it took me some time to really get into socializing with other people. Another thing you want to consider, and that really depends on where you're from and where you're going, is healthcare and health insurance. What does your employer do? Do they do anything? What does your country do for you? And all these kind of things that you should consider. For me, especially going to the US, I was under the impression that there is no health insurance. So I had an international health insurance, which I ended up not needing, because universities typically take care of your healthcare. But it is certainly something to double check before traveling. Another thing that I made a very big mistake with that, I traveled to the US and I brought like $50 cash. And I didn't even consider this, but if you want to go to a different country and you start working, you're not getting paid right away. So you should be able to support yourself to buy food and stuff like that, at least for the first month or two, before you're actually getting paid. And then you support yourself further. But in the very beginning, you want to make sure that you eat. And that was a very interesting time. You get very resourceful, but I still don't recommend it. And another thing, and this is very specific to the US, is you need a car. Especially where I was in this small town with this small university, there is no public transportation. It just simply does not exist. So if you want to go anywhere besides in this little town I was in, you need a car. And interestingly, I never had a car in Germany. I never needed one. but I ended up buying a car in the US because I simply required it. So this was an interesting thing that I didn't consider at all in the beginning, but ended up to be very relevant to me. So these are just a few things to consider when really going to a different country. And another thing that hit me personally a lot, and I think is also relevant wherever you want to go, is communicating. I'm German. I'm pretty direct. I'm pretty open. Some people might consider that blunt, but I say what I think. And especially in a scientific conversation, if you have a hypothesis and I think this hypothesis is great, then I will tell you that it's great. If I, however, think that your hypothesis is wrong, then I will try to disprove it. And if I have proof, then I will tell you here, this is my proof. And I think your hypothesis is wrong and we have to rethink it. This is my way of communicating. What I learned in the US is that, and again, I'm not generalizing to everyone. I can just tell you what I experienced. Is people are very, very friendly to your face, but they are very easily offended and they take things personally. With the example that I just had, I scientifically criticized the hypothesis that was out there. I did not criticize the person who put the hypothesis out there. But some people have this feeling that they get personally attacked if I tell them that these kind of things are wrong, and if I can prove them wrong. So unfortunately, this is not just a thing in everyday life. This is actually a thing in science, which makes certain discussions with certain people very difficult. So it can be challenging to learn how to talk to people. So the takeaway here is that you need to learn the culture you are going to. And you can really only do that once you go there. There isn't really any way to do that beforehand. You can read up on it a little bit, but you have to learn that, and you want to make sure that you know how people communicate before going all in. I wish I would have known that. I didn't, and it led to certain conflicts. So it's really good to know. Right. Central Michigan, just to summarize my experiences there, it's a small university, which is great for some reasons, because you got very close contact with your peers and PIs. The project itself involved 5 universities in the US, which is what I said before. There's new science that took place. And I got to know many people from many different places all over the world, which I really appreciate, because I really like this diverse thinking in terms of science. And the cons are more so related with what I just talked about on the last slide. It can be difficult to talk to PIs about a difference of opinion in a scientific context. And it is possible, and again, just my experience, that new ideas can be suppressed if they don't fit with the PI's goals. So if your boss has a different idea about a certain thing, then they might disregard your ideas. Fair enough. Central Michigan University, same thing as with the small university in Freiberg, where I studied. There's only the university, there's nothing else around. And this can be good, this can be bad. Now, I briefly go over the science that we actually conducted, just for your information, pretty much. We did beyond density functional theory calculation in terms of self-interaction corrections. We are having this new educational approach to carry out these calculations. And I myself created a few programs that advanced this research field, which are in use today. And I'm still working in this field, this flow-seq field, not with the CMU people, but actually with the colleagues in Freiberg. And we're still making advances in this field, which I'm very grateful for. So the collaborations are really something that I highly value and are really relevant for my research. Now, to talk a little bit about my time at Stanford. After the 3 years at Central Michigan University, I was looking for something new. And I did consider another postdoc position, and then I got very lucky that I found this postdoc position at Stanford. Stanford is a massive university. It has a lot of resources, which is actually very nice for people who start their postdoc at Stanford. So if you want to come to the US and you start at Stanford, there are much more resources for you in terms of socialization, for example, in terms of resources for postdocs. There's much more availability of this information that was really lacking in a smaller university like Central Michigan. So this is highly valuable, I think, especially in the current time where nothing is in person. It's relevant that these kind of informations are out there. I also got the pleasure to really work with great people. I really have the possibility to really explore the science that we are conducting, and I have very open conversations with my boss. So this is all really great for me. Another thing about Stanford and the location where Stanford is, I mean, it is kind of sort of Silicon Valley. So if you consider going into industry, I think the possibilities for industry are not endless, but there is a lot around here. So this might be a good place to start looking for industry jobs. Now, there are some downsides, and the biggest downside is very clearly that the cost of living is absolutely ridiculous. And not really maintainable with the way postdocs are paid. So one thing you might want to consider if you want to stay in academia, and this is a more general statement, this is not related to Stanford. If you want to stay in academia and you want to spend a lot of time and effort, I mean, you've seen I've been working in academia for like the last 10 years easily, and I'm still, advancing in my field. It doesn't pay. A postdoc position doesn't pay as much as it should. And especially here, where the cost of living and the cost of absolutely everything else is so high, the compensation for that can be very small. For example, my wife is an elementary teacher, and she makes more than me, which is interesting. So together we're fine. But if you would be alone out here, you would have a pretty hard time maintaining yourself. So this is just something to keep in mind in general. In academia, it doesn't pay as much as other jobs. Right. Again, very briefly, going over the science. We're working on new approximations for density functional theory calculations. We're employing some sort of machine learning techniques and trying to figure out the advantages of this approach and also the limitations as to what we can do in order to make these approximations better. But again, I'm not going to go into any detail here. If you have any questions, just let me know. Right. So a little bit of a summary. In general, in academia, I think personally it is a great idea to go to a different country. You will learn a lot. It'll give you a lot of independence. If you're already independent, that's great. It'll still help you. But if you are like me and you have never been to a different country, it'll give you a lot of self-confidence if you can actually pull through and stay there for a certain amount of time. And I also think it's especially appropriate for younger scientists. With younger, I mean pretty much anybody who is like between the ages of 20 and 30. Because once you get a little older, you might want to get more settled. You might want to plan a family and whatnot. And as soon as you have these kind of ties and things around you, it can become much more difficult to decide to go to a different country. So this is something to keep in mind for your scientific journey. And in the academia, I guess the really logical steps are you do a PhD after you're doing your master's, for example, and then potentially get a postdoc position. You want to consider that postdoc positions are always for a very short amount of time. It's typically a yearly contract, which allows you to gain some experience in a specific field, and you can become an expert in that field, but it gives you zero stability and zero permanent outlook on what you want to do, so it becomes rather difficult to plan for family if you only have these yearly contracts, and then after that year you have no idea where you want to go or where you're going. So the ups and downs. Now, one more thing, and this is, I guess, relevant for the topic of globalization. If you want to stay in academia, one great thing that hasn't happened for the last 2 years, but hopefully will happen at some point in the future, are conferences. Conferences give you a space where you can present the research you're conducting to a broader community outside of your group. And it allows you to network. And I think networking is something that is very, very important to advance in your field, to really present yourself and your science to other researchers. And this can also bring you, if you have, for example, you have your PhD and you have a conference and then you're looking for postdoc positions, this is a great place to advertise yourself. And conferences typically take place at many different places all around the world. When I was in Germany, I got to travel around the entirety of Europe for just to go to these conferences. And I think this is true in other countries. So conferences in themselves are a great way to really connect different places, different people, and get new ideas and new science. Now, I want to talk just a minute about industry. I'm not an expert about industry because I never went into industry, but the general perspectives that I brought for academia are, I think, still true. It's always a good idea to go to a different country if you intend to stay in research or really go into industry and work. You will still learn a lot and you will still become more independent. And I still think it's more appropriate for younger people. Getting a job overseas, it will pay you more than a postdoc. I mentioned that a little bit, postdocs are not compensated as much as they should. But it might be a little trickier to get a job overseas if you're not already in the country that you're applying for. So this is certainly something to keep in mind. And in order to not extend my time here, I just want to finish with some take-home messages. So I kept saying this, I'm just going to say it once again. I think it's a good idea for every young scientist, researcher, or whoever you are to go overseas, at least for a little bit, because it'll give you independence and confidence and gives you, I think, new perspectives about yourself and about what you want to do and where you want to go. Research is probably the easier way to work overseas. So if you get a PhD position or a postdoc position or a master's position in a different country, this is a great way to explore different countries and to get out of wherever you are right now. And you can always come back. Industry might be a little more difficult, but again, I'm not really the expert, so I'm not going to say too much about it. And I think, in my opinion and in my experience, globalization in research is very, very present, significantly important, and will only become more important in the future. And I think it has been shown that these kind of globalization, collaborations, and whatnot are fundamentally important in order to do proper research and proper science. And with that, and I think I'm pretty much at my time limit, I want to thank all of you for your attention. I want to again thank the organizers very much for the invitation. I think it's a great event and a great cause. And please do not hesitate to ask any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trepte. It was very nice to hear about your experience. You show us very important aspects that people may find only when they are in the middle of the experience. One that I find particularly interesting is the moment that you wait for your first paycheck abroad. And you forget to bring your money. Sometimes your credit card doesn't work very well. And if you have currency problems, it makes things very interesting. So thank you very much for all these details. They were very interesting. And we have some questions from our audience.
Yeah.
I would just give them a brief instruction in Portuguese, if you let me. Caso alguém tenha alguma pergunta para ser feita, eu posso traduzi-la, se vocês preferirem, escrever em inglês no chat, ou escrever em português, eu posso traduzi-la. Okay, so for first question, Bianca asked, Germany, Australia, USA, where to next?
That is actually an excellent question. As of right now, I'm doing my postdoc position right here. My goal is to be a professor, and where this is going to be really depends on where I apply. I'm currently applying in the US, and I'm applying in Europe, mostly in Germany. But it'll really depend on who's going to give me an interview and who will, give me that opportunity to be a professor somewhere. I have no fixed plans to stay anywhere right now. I'm really open to either Germany or US or Europe, or even Australia. I mean,
or maybe perhaps you can find you a place here in São Carlos.
Who knows?
Okay, next question from Dr. Florian. Thanks for the insights into your experience. You said about 70% are non-Americans. Why you think this is the case? Americans do not enter science after their studies?
So this is a great question, and I think this has something to do with how the US in of itself works. I mean, the US is a capitalistic country, and as I said, if you stay in science, you're not getting paid as much as, for example, if you were to go into business, into industry, into something else. And I actually heard professors talking about this, and I think this is why people in the US do not go into the sciences, because it simply does not pay. And yeah, I think with that, the US heavily relies on people coming from the outside in order to carry out the science that they do.
And I think there's another problem is some very famous person, such as Mark Zuckerberg, they brag because they have made a fortune without being in university. So
that is very true.
It was one or two guys that did that. So it gives.
So you could do it too, yeah.
Yes, perhaps you could, but it would be easier if you have proper training.
I strongly believe in having a proper education, and even if it's hard and it's a long way, I think if you have the passion about science, it does pay off.
Okay.
Not in terms of money, but in terms of life experience.
I have a question. Where to find good opportunities to work abroad? Where do I look if I'm interested?
So at least for my specific field, there are certain websites, but I think there are other websites where there's a lot of announcements regarding even postdoc positions. So what I would do is just to look online somewhere, probably Googling, to postdoc position announcements online. And there's a number of websites like Higher Ed Jobs, Science Careers. There are probably more, where you can specify that you're looking for a postdoc position or a PhD position or professor position, whatever. And then you can specify your expertise, your research field and stuff like that. And then it'll update you on all the new announcements of these kind of jobs that are out there. So I think this is one way. The other way is to talk to your boss. They might know people who are looking for people. So I think networking within your scientific group is always a good starting point.
Okay. Girls from the organization, do we have time for one more question, perhaps? They're the bosses.
Excellent.
Yes, we have time.
I like you. Question.
Oh, let me see if the audience have another question.
So there's another question in the chat. What are the main characteristics that a scientist must have to become globalized? I think this is an excellent question. So it more or less summarizes my talk to an extent, because let's say I go back. Let's go back 15 years or so. This is when I kind of sort of finished my high school. I had no idea where to go. I didn't think that I would end up in the US or anywhere else besides, Dresden, for that matter. So I think one characteristic, and I think this is one thing to learn somehow, is that you have to know, or you have to realize what you want to do as a scientist. Because if you know that, then you can be more focused on looking for positions that are in line with that. And the other thing I think is that if you have a very clear idea of who you are as a scientist, you do become more confident. And I think confidence and independence, to an extent, are relevant skills if you want to go that path of going to a different country. Because otherwise you will have significant problems. Learning a different language is a hassle. And communicating and trying to find friends and all this kind of stuff. It takes time and it takes effort. But if you're able to do that, then I think you can become globalized, and then it'll be easier once you started this process in one country or the other.
Okay. Perhaps we have one final question. Is in the chat. My question is about DFT. Are there any challenges to apply industrial projects? FEM is widely applied, but
yes. DFT is I think nowadays everybody applies DFT to absolutely everything. I think one of the bigger things that are typically used in industry is the application for DFT for lithium-ion batteries, for example, for the description of new materials that can be used for battery materials. That's one research area where I think industry partners are very interested in that. I also heard about industry partners in the development of DFT approximations, which is kind of sort of what I'm doing. But of course, with the focus on applying that to a very specific problem. We are doing more the basic science, but I think this is also being applied to industry nowadays. And given the wide availability of DFT codes that are out there, of course, they can be applied by anyone. So I think pretty much, I think battery materials is, I think, one big field. Probably material research nowadays, I think, has a big impact from a computational side, because you can study thousands of different materials, which might not even exist right now, but you can study them computationally and predict whether they are stable or not, and then see what kind of properties they might have and which ones would be interesting to do in a lab and which ones might not have any characteristics you need. So these kind of things are actually... like the high throughput calculations are nowadays common. And this is also done in industry, I'm pretty sure.
And I am an experimentalist. What happens when your projections are different from the experiments?
So I do have my personal opinion about this.
Don't you hate it?
No, absolutely not. No, I think experiments are super relevant, theory is super relevant, but what shouldn't happen is that one side says they are correct. I think it's just two ways to look at a problem. You get two outcomes, and then you have to see whether they agree or not. And if they don't, then you got to analyze who's wrong, or if they're both wrong. But I think what one should do is to not say, okay, the theory is correct, and our experience has to match that, or the other way around. Because there are errors in the theory, there are errors in experiment, always. So a one-to-one match is never going to happen. But I think looking at it from, it's just two different paths you can take to study a certain property, and you get two answers out. And then you got to analyze these different answers with respect to the limitations of your experiment.
You are a nicer physicist than the ones we have around here. They have very less nice opinions about experiments.
Well, I think
guess
I got lucky enough to work with some experimentalists in the past who also kind of shaped my point of view a little.
that's very nice. Well, I'd like to thank you very much again for your attention and for your presentation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I guess I will return to the organization now.